Hi, Emma. I'm just going to unmute you now. Hello, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm good, thank you.
Great, thank you so much for doing our very first session. We have got 253 people watching you live, so this is now a large lecture theatre, all interested in your fabulous research, doing memory research online. So, over to you.
Over to me. Well, thank you very much for organising such a fantastic looking day. I'm really excited for some of the talks to come later on. So I've been tasked to talk all about memory research. So I'm going to talk about the kinds of challenges that we face to get our studies online and how we got around them. But I also wanted to talk about some of the administrative load and the things I've learned about taking it steady. So some tips for staying on top of data collection in these circumstances. So for some context, the kinds of projects that we've been running online. The first one that I'm going to use as an example is a project that looked at memory for new words heard in stories. So this had two experiments, both recruited via Prolific and programmed in Gorilla. And during the encoding task for this experiment, participants simply had to listen along to a story with some illustrations. And within the story, there were some new made-up words that we were later going to test their memory for. Then we tested their memory 3 times, so straight after they'd listened to the story, the next day and 1 week later. And we tested their memory using 2 tasks at each test point. So we tested their ability to produce the new word when we gave them a cue. So we did this either by typed responses or spoken responses, depending on the experiment. And we also included a recognition task as well. So some challenges when we were trying to get this experiment online were thinking about whether the story was playing, whether the participants could hear it, and indeed whether they'd stayed paying attention to that story during that whole time, because we had no other marker of them doing an activity, they just had to listen. Obviously, there's a challenge of coordinating the multiple test sessions. How do you make sure participants come back? And a final challenge of collecting spoken responses. So I'm not actually going to talk about that aspect in my talk today, but I'm very happy to discuss it later on in the speaker's corner or in the questions. The second project that we've run completely online was looking at multi-element event memories. So these were 5 smaller experiments. And in this particular experiment, we were looking at participants' ability to remember multi-element events, so events consisting of an animal, an object, and a location. And in this particular version of the experiment, we actually wanted to look at how well participants could build up those kinds of memories, even when they learned each pairwise association separately. So they would see an animal and an object and a location, and an animal and location, and we looked at how well they integrated those memories across trials. So the test for this was actually very simple. So it was just a single test point, and they just had to do a 4 alternative forced choice task. But the reason I also wanted to include this as an example was because the encoding phase was quite challenging in this circumstance. So again, participants didn't have to make any responses during learning. We had no marker of whether they were engaging. But the consequences were particularly important for this study. So in a normal memory study, I think perhaps if participants haven't paid attention the entire time, their performance might be slightly lower, performance might be slightly more variable overall, but it might not matter that much. Whereas here, if participants aren't integrating information across trials, we're left wondering whether that's for interesting theoretical reasons or simply because the participants wandered off and made a cup of tea. So we wanted to have a marker that they'd been there for the entire time, and that was a real challenge. So how did we overcome these kinds of challenges? How do we know that participants are engaging in encoding tasks when we don't have any other kind of marker? So first, I always started with a technical check. So we needed the browsers to allow us to play sounds to the participant. So we tried to make this as quick and as foolproof as possible. So I would play a spoken word through the browser, and participants just had to type that word in order to be able to continue with the experiment. And that's available for reuse here, or you might be able to make a slightly nicer looking version yourself. And then in terms of gauging whether participants had been there and paid attention, this was very different across the 2 studies. So for the story study, we kept this very simple, and we just asked participants some extra questions after they'd finished listening. So if you remember, this wasn't our main memory interest for the study. We were interested in their ability to learn the new words. But we just simply asked what colour were the characters, what was the main character's name? And these were multiple choice questions and designed to be very simple. We know that kids can do this fine in the lab. So it's really just a very basic attention check. And you'll see that most participants pass this, no problem. But as I mentioned for the event memory study, not paying attention had much more serious consequences for our data. So in this particular experiment, we then embedded attention trials within each block. So once per block, rather than the stimuli appearing, we would just see that up on the screen, participants would see it just said, press the space bar. All they had to do was press the space bar within the time limit. So that was a way of us seeing that they were still there, still paying attention to the screen throughout. And you'll see that this was actually a lot more stringent. We lost around a third of participants due to this. And I think generally speaking, I probably wouldn't want something quite that stringent unless I had to, but it had very serious consequences for our research question that justified using that kind of measure. And checks like this really beg the question of whether we want participants to continue with the study. And this is a really tricky area, and we have to be very careful here that we're being fair. If we're embedding exclusions, we need to make sure that participants are aware that we're doing it. And you might want to consider paying them for the time they've done anyway. But I think, especially if it comes to a large multi-session study, you maybe don't want to be paying participants for all of those subsequent sessions when you've got fairly good evidence that they weren't paying attention to start with. So you might want to think about whether you can build that in, build those kinds of exclusions in, depending on your research question. With retrieval tasks, I'm just going to whiz through this because other people are talking about data quality later. But we've always had some kind of accuracy threshold, and how stringent this is depends on our research question and the particular setup. And you can see that then that affects how many participants you end up excluding and having to replace. But generally at this stage, I'd always be paying participants unless I've got good evidence that they haven't been engaging with the task properly. So if they've either been bashing the keyboard and responding too quickly for it to have made any sense, or if you can see that they've just let every trial time out, then obviously I would question whether they deserve payment. And I also always include a post-experiment survey. So I ask participants to describe any technical problems that they had, but also to describe the strategies that they were using. So in the story study, a small handful of participants said that they wrote the words down, and obviously we wanted them to exclude them from analysis. So the million-dollar question, how do we make participants come back for multiple test sessions? And this can really be quite challenging. If you're recruiting locally and you have email addresses and phone numbers, you might be able to develop some kind of prompt system a little bit more easily. But obviously during using recruitment systems, that anonymity is built into the system, so we don't have that information. But generally, there's guidance available. People know that we want to do these kinds of studies. I recommend that you always run them in small batches. Don't release your entire sample at once. Do small groups of participants at a time. And be aware that you might have to do quite a lot of work to set this up. So at least on Prolific, you have to set up each session individually, and you'll do that for each set of participants you run through. So that's probably more detail than you need to know right now, aside from knowing that actually it's quite a lot of work to keep monitoring that, keep checking which participants have completed the sessions and re-inviting them. And that's important because actually you'll want to be sending them reminders. So you'll need to be monitoring your experiment platform, seeing who hasn't done it yet, and sending them probes and prods for them to complete the session. And you'll probably need to do that on an individual basis, so it does take time. Talking about getting them set up, you need to be specific about when you want your participants to complete the sessions. So if you don't want them to be completing it at midnight or at 1 o'clock in the morning, then you need to be specific. And it's also worth bearing in mind that you should really try and be available during the times that your participants are doing the experiment. So for our story study, we had the cutoff at 9 p.m, but that meant really that I had to be monitoring my emails until that time, monitoring the experiment platform, and also being available at 9 p.m. to cut it so that participants didn't do it past the cutoff time. And I also wanted to mention using bonus payments. So I think these are actually really useful, and I think I would use these more in future. So in the story study, we had an extra £1 payment for participants who completed the sessions within the same sort of time window on each occasion. and actually around 80% of participants were eligible for that. And they were very aware of it. So if I didn't process it straight away, I'd get lots of messages about their eligibility for this bonus payment and why they hadn't received it yet. So I think you could really use that to incentivize participants to get to the final test session. And really then, it's really worth investing time in all of this because losing participants is expensive. So I think within the lab, if a participant doesn't bother to show up to a later test session, they don't actually tend to bother to show up to then collect their payment for the first one. Whereas online, it's really on you to still pay participants for the time they've put in that first, that second test session, even if you can't lose their data. So it's worth really putting the time into chasing participants, giving them reminders, being available when they have issues, so that you can avoid these costs mounting up. And to give you an indication, those costs are very real. So this is the first time we ran the story experiment. This is the attrition from the end of the first test session to the follow-up the next day and a week later, and these were exclusions for other reasons. And you can see the first time I ran the story study, I had to over-recruit by a lot, and I'm actually a little bit embarrassed by this graph. But I was still learning my way around how to manage this, dealing with all the different issues, and it was quite a challenging study to run. And you can see that the second time, this was much better. I actually only lost 6 participants across the first day. And I think there are 2 reasons for this. So first, I was much better prepared. I knew the kinds of issues to expect and how to deal with them. But also, because I was collecting spoken responses, I was really wary of something going wrong with that aspect. And that meant I was being much more cautious in the number of participants I was releasing at once. I was taking the whole thing a lot more steadily. And I think that was really important to then being able to give participants the attention and minimize dropout rate. So how do we stay on top of all this data when it's coming in, multiple batches of participants at different times? There's lots of things you need to pay attention to know whether you're going to include them. First, I highly recommend making a very thorough plan to start with, exactly who you'll keep, who you'll replace, and when you'll stop recruiting. And doing this in the context of a pre-registration is obviously very good for open research, but it also forces you to put together a very thorough plan. And that brings me on to my second point, and that really it's very, very helpful to try and script as much of the data processing as possible. So I think compared to testing in person, testing online is a much more iterative process. You're releasing groups of participants at once, seeing how many of them are eligible, re-releasing new groups. And to make those decisions about who you include, you'll have to be integrating lots of information across lots of different files. And if you're doing that manually, time and time again, that's going to become exhausting and probably very error prone and stressful as well. So whilst learning to script might be stressful, I think it's really worth the effort to put in that preparation. And if you're feeling a bit daunted about getting started, a cheeky, shameless plug, I put together a tutorial about how to try and get started processing data files from Gorilla, including building in those kinds of eligibility checks that some people might find useful. So I call this a half marathon, not a sprint, because it really takes preparation to build an online study. And there are other people talking about data quality later today. Multi-session studies really do have an extra high administrative load. So my recommendation is to start really small, get a few participants through the whole experiment first, learn the kinds of issues that they have, and then later you can start to release slightly larger batches at a time. But I think I often had to remind myself that data collection was still my job and that it should take time. So it's very easy. You hear all these stories about really fast online collection. You know, you press go, you make a cup of tea and you have your data. And that's true in some circumstances, but with a multi-session study, it does take a lot more effort to get those participants, and it will take time. Less time than in the lab, but it still takes time. And if those aren't kind of convincing enough reasons for you to slow down, I wanted to add a final warning that server errors are real. So most online platforms will have some kind of warning that you should only release as many participants as you can afford to lose. And that's very easy because it's so rare, it's very easy to kind of forget and think you can go ahead of, but they do happen sometimes. Luckily for us, it happened in a very small experiment where it was very easy to run it again. But if you've released your entire sample of participants and they're on their third session of a multi-session study and something crashes and you have to do it all over again, that's going to be extremely expensive. So it's really worth just taking it steady.
Emma, one more minute, unless you've...
Well, that is all I have to say.
Perfect.
So thank you very much for listening. I hope you all enjoy the day, and I wish you a very happy online data collection.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was great. Next up, we're going. Joe's going to ask you a couple of questions while I get Gwen sharing her slides.
So first off, thanks, Emma, very much. It's always really odd speaking into the void, as it were, and not getting any direct feedback. That was a great talk. So many really, really helpful and insightful steps there about how we design and do these experiments. I was looking at that graph where you looked at the dropout, and it looked like maybe in your second experiment, the main loss was actually sort of at the final step, was the data quality. So it wasn't actually so many people dropping out once you'd gotten all your techniques right. Is that what you were seeing?
I think so. So with that one, we didn't see much between day 1 and day 2. The week one was the one that it was harder to get people back for. And I guess when people are committing, they don't really know what they're going to be doing in a week's time, some of the time, and it's a bit more distant. So I'd say it was still kind of mostly that third dropout, and then yeah, a few issues with people saying that they'd written the words down. There was one particular task that was a bit buggy that I managed to fix halfway through when I finally sussed out what the problem was. So yeah, then the data loss came from that. But...
Yeah, no, that's really impressive. I see that Gwen's slides are up, so it's possible that we're going to have to keep the rest of the questions to speakers' corners.
I'll be there.
But thanks again, Emma.
Thank
Great
you.
talk.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Thank you so much.